Okay, it's a Wednesday, the 9th of October. Let's get today's business morning together for our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. Let's get started with the breaking news just coming through from the International Monetary Fund. Hold it a second. We understand everyone wants to get a bit more details into President Buhari's Tuesday's budget presentation to the National Assembly. But this is big story. The IMF says it's concluded its staff visit to Nigeria between late September and October the 7th. Now, the report is just coming through from the IMF issuing a report on Nigeria saying that the country's economic recovery is continuing, but recovery, quote unquote, remains slow, according to this report from the IMF. Says inflation is falling, external buffers are declining in the face of increased portfolio outflows. According to the IMF, just coming through, the Nigeria has what you call elevated fiscal deficit on central bank financing, which the IMF says is complicating monetary policy, according to the IMF. So the International Monetary Fund says Nigeria needs action on a coherent and coordinated set of policies urgently needed to reduce vulnerabilities and increase growth over the medium term. This report from the IMF is coming through this morning, less than 24 hours after President Buhari presented Budget 2020 and signaled the direction of the economy moving forward. According to the International Monetary Fund report just coming through, Nigeria's economic growth for this year is expected to pick up to 2.3% this year on the back of recovery in the oil sector and Nigeria gaining momentum in agriculture following a good harvest, quoting directly from the statement. Revenue plan or revenue initiatives by the Buhari's administration under the year 2020 budget, which Mr. President presented yesterday, including those of VAT. The IMF says those two will help Nigeria partially offset declining oil revenues and the impact of the higher minimum wage, keeping Nigeria's consolidated fiscal deficit at elevated level. The IMF also speak about the worries over the overlap of 2018 and 2019 budget and the government over-reliance on excessive or expensive borrowing from the central bank to finance the government's fiscal deficit. On the banking sector, this is what the IMF has to say in this three-page report released this morning. Banking sector prudential ratios are improving. That's one good news. According to the central bank has been moving with new regulations and rules in the banking sector on credit. Now the IMF says Nigeria's banking sector prudential ratios for banks are improving. However, according to the IMF, new regulations to small lending, which are recently increased, should be carefully assessed and may need to be revisited in view of the potential unintended consequences on Nigerian banks' asset quality, maturity structure, prudential buffers, and inflation target. That's some of the highlights of this new report. Just breaking news coming through from the International Monetary Fund, part of the report issued at the conclusion of the staff visit to Nigerian government and officials within the week of September the 25th to October the 7th. That was on Monday this week. So let's get started as far as the budget was concerned. Yesterday, that was a budget presentation, but Mr. President did more than present 2020 budget proposals. He also provided a signaling on the state of the economy and how he wants the economy to go forward. Beyond budget 2020, what are the details in this budget presentation yesterday? Mr. President, as you may already know, attached what you call the finance bill to the budget proposals, targeting 5 strategic objectives of his administration for the consideration of the National Assembly. The finance bill, according to Mr. President, is looking for incremental achievement, but necessary changes to Nigeria's fiscal laws to help take the economy a step forward. The bill, the finance bill, according to Mr. President, is looking to promote fiscal equity by mitigating instances of quote-unquote regressive taxation. That's what the fiscal equity means. The President says the administration is looking how to spread out the new tax laws and practices in a manner that will not hurt Nigerians. Part of the pillars of the new finance bill talked about yesterday was reforming domestic tax laws in line with global best practices. So there will be tax incentives for those who are invested in infrastructure and the capital market. Remember, the extent exemption of VAT on stock market and securities market, which was earlier put in place by the previous administration, had expired in July. Now that was not talked about. The president is likely looking at moving it out once again. Meantime, the finance bill will also support medium and small enterprises in line with the ease of business reforms under PEBEC and raising government revenue. The draft finance bill is proposing VAT to 7.5% is now official, and budget 2020 was based on a new threshold of the VAT to 7.5%. Where would the money go? Health, education, and infrastructure, partly HDI and the other in terms of development. What else are we looking at into the Finance Bill 2019? Seeking to expand exemption of wider range of items that Nigerians will not be paying VAT on. That include agro products in the main that are used to make beverages, staples, cereals, dairy, meat, among other things. A very long list Mr. President spoke about yesterday. And who will be paying the VAT registration? Mr. President says any company that has a turnover of 25 million below that will not be included in the new VAT. Mr. President says this will allow the Federal Inland Revenue Service to focus on big businesses in Nigeria to pay VAT and not for smaller companies. So if you think the new VAT will apply to your one-man or roadside business, Mr. President says you are now exempted unless you have a turnover of 25 million naira. So what's new in the new budget presentation, which is more than the budget, but more on the economy? It's about Mr. President saying while the budget is principal fiscal tool for the government for socio-economic development targets, the administration remained committed to prudently planning for our future economic prosperity. So what is practically new? Mr. President says the new finance, budget, and national planning ministry has been directed to commence preparations towards the development of a successor medium and long-term economic development plans. Simply put, Mr. President says it is time to scrap Vision 2020 that started about 3 administrations ago, and the ERGP, which his own administration designed in 2016, both are expiring next year. Mr. President says they should be laid to rest, and now there should be a new national development plan to bring the economy on speed. Budget 2020, however, according to Mr. President, is expected to speed up economic recovery, help diversification, competitiveness, social inclusion, job creation, and lift many people out of poverty. Quite a lot. So we had our team here yesterday, our panelists, discussing this after Mr. President's presentation. In case you missed that, we'll try to squeeze a bit of that for you and take a listen to our panelists.
Central bank governor and his team are the race car driver. But if they're driving a car from the 1950s, they're not competitive in the race. It's up to the legislature and the executive arm to build the race car. And then I have no doubt that the structures we have, central bank structures, can drive the race car just fine. But whether or not the MPC raises rates 0.5% or lowers than 0.5% is not going to fix our problems.
Well, let's get back to Abuja Studios and ask Eze Oyepere, who is the lead director at the Center for Social Justice. Mr. President says there will be, all the MDAs are asked not to include new projects in the 2020 budget, only the ones that are existing, fix them. And some folks have said already on social media, on Twitter, and says we could run a maintenance budget for the next few years and we'll be good. Get done with what we have. Don't start new projects. Do you think this will resolve some of the problem we have with budget padding and things like that, because there are new projects for anyone to put money on? What's your take?
In the past, we've even canvassed for what is called a project implementation and continuity at PICA, in the sense that until you finish the projects you have, in fact, the money available now cannot even finish the projects that are existing in the next 2 to 3 years. So why introduce new projects? What we've had has led to project abandonment. It led to a situation where there will be 1,000 projects, say 1,000 road projects in the budget, but the money available can only do maybe 50 to 60. So why don't we have a scenario where we concentrate on the first 50, 60, finish them, and then before starting new ones? One of my friends had likened it to a situation where somebody had 10 plots of land, but he has only money that can finish constructing a duplex each on 2 of them. Instead of finishing constructing the duplex, maybe leaving one and let one out, he starts the foundation on the 10 and gets stuck at the DPC level. He doesn't have a house completed and nothing is done and he has no money to continue. So that's the kind of thing we are doing in Nigeria. But I'm afraid also for the budget, because if you look at the indicators, in 2019, we are told as at the half year, we only realized 58% of the projected revenue, meaning that we had a negative variance of 42%. And that has been the variance in previous years as well. So if we continue budgeting like this, where the forecasts are not necessarily based on empirical evidence, simply that we want to collect more money, at the end of the day, we have 30, 40, 50% variance. There is no way we can implement this budget. So that's why I'm also a little bit happy that the president has said that we need to review our tech from the production sharing agreements with international oil companies. But if you look at the law enabling us to do that, it did not say we have to amend the existing law. It simply said that we have to renegotiate with these companies. So the idea that until you enact a new legislation, you cannot renegotiate those terms is not tenable. I believe that the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, the NNPC, and the presidency should set machinery in motion to be able to renegotiate those terms. Again, I look at even the MTF itself. He made projection for the realization of 200 billion naira from stamp duties. Now, these stamp duties, they've been collecting it for the past 5, 6, 7 years. Many of us have sent FYI requests to say, where is this money going? And they've been telling us stories and fables. Suddenly, you have simply 200 billion naira for 2020. What has happened to the money that they've been collecting in previous years? Where is the money? They need to account for it. They need to tell Nigerians where it is. And I'm also insisting that 200 billion from the volume of stamp duties we do every day, even in my little organization, I know how much we do in a year, cannot be a realistic estimate. We need to collect not less than 1 trillion naira from stamp duties. So that particular revenue source is grossly underrated and undervalued. So I believe that if the leakages are plugged, in terms of even the kind of income that comes to some of these state-owned companies, government agencies, profits that they make that they are not properly remitting to Treasury, that we have a lot more money to be able to implement the budget.
I'm interested, thank you, Eze, but I'm interested in the ERGP and the new National Development Plan that Mr. President talked about. So I'm going to get this conversation back here. We'll get back to you, Tafra, in Abuja in a bit, but let me ask Yomi Olugbenro of Deloitte here. When we talk about a National Development Plan, it looks like Mr. President is alluding to the fact that ERGP is going to be rested, is getting to the end of his tenure. It looks like he hasn't bite as much as Mr. President perhaps would want. So he thinks he wants more of a medium to long-term development plan in place. Do you think this is the way to go?
No, absolutely the right way to go. So you remember that ERGP was an intervention development plan on the back of the recession. Exactly. So we went into recession 2015, 2016, and we needed to have a recovery and growth plan. And ERGP came in as a medium rolling plan. So now that we're getting out of this current administration, by the time this current administration is completely over, I think what the country needs, it's more of a medium to long-term plan where we could return back to, the type of the first national development plan that we had in the country, so that successive administration can build on, what each prior administration did. So I'm delighted to hear that from the president.
Andrew, what's your take on the ERGP and what Mr. President hinted about, that the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning would have to come up with another national development plan?
No, I think we need that. I guess what I would like to say, along with what I've been saying in this program, is ERGP was 200 pages. Again, it had a high level of complexity, many new intervention programs. And we've been saying for some time, look, development's going to happen at the state and zonal level. States need to get on with it. And obviously we're seeing lots of states, Kaduna State, Edo State, Oyo State, Ogun are ones I'm familiar with, where the governors are really pushing their agenda, their development agenda in a positive way. So I think this next plan, and the vice president, very interesting, I had not heard this out of the federal government, but it was reported maybe yesterday, the vice president came out and said the states need to have more responsibility for the development. So I would like to see a plan come out in the next round that's simpler and makes it clear to the governors that actually a lot of the responsibility needs to reside with the states. Now, of course, if they have the responsibility, we also need to think through what powers the states have versus which are restricted items for the federal government. And again, if reported accurately, His Excellency the Vice President said that the other day.
Yeah, Mr. President says the states will get more of the VAT, so they should invest more in education, in healthcare, and all of that. So let's put this to Abraham in Abuja. What more would you like to see from the subnationals when you talk about the states? Mr. President spoke about a new finance bill that will support SMEs on the ease of doing business. What would you like to see more in this area done by the government for and on behalf of the states?
Thank you again, Bosi Omofai. What I'd like to see from the states, it's important that we keep track of the history of Nigeria's economic development. If you recall, at the time where there was a time Nigeria's anchor plan was needs 1 and needs 2, National Economic Empowerment and Development Strategy 1 and 2. During that era, you have the states also have the SEEDS, State Economic Empowerment Development Scheme, and then the local governments also had Local Government Economic Empowerment and Development Scheme. But since the president came up with the 2017-2020 ERGP, we did not see the states replicate state ERGP or local government ERGP. Just like Jide said there, the intervention plan for 2016 was the strategic implementation plan. But for 2017 to 2020, it was deliberate ERGP planning. And this ERGP planning, BOSIN, has mapped out specific strategies for priority sectors for which this government wants to achieve key records. So for states not to have their own equivalent of the ERGP and for local government to do likewise, that would be, it will reflect like the economy in terms of political planning is not in sync. The ERGP also have clear objectives for SMEs, for job creation and for inclusive plans generally. So I would like to see states buy into that and to have their own version of this key plan. Then, just to emphasize, in as much as the president emphasized in his speech that he wants to sustain the ERGP into a long-term development plan, let's not forget, Nigeria does not exist in isolation. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that at the moment serves as a shadow, as a dummy, perhaps a long-term guide for Nigeria's long-term development plan. So what we'd like to see in terms of global consistency is the budget buying into the ERGP and the ERGP buying into some aspect of the SDGs. Yes, it is good to own our own development plan, but we still cannot have a radical deviation from the goals in terms of what what our long-term plan will say in terms of our long-term plan basically has to be in sync with the SDGs. So it is important to see the states follow up on ERGP and also have their own micro-level key performance indicators to track the attainment of the 17 SDGs while we await the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning to come up with some alternative for the ERGP going forward.
Okay, thank you. We'll talk about how to implement this budget within the minutes left on the show. But gentlemen, we need to talk about the headline metrics as Mr. President presented them, the production target, oil price target, headline figure, the deficit in the budget, the capital expenditure, and the revenue. So, an exchange rate and the GDP outlook, which the finance budget and national planning minister talked about 3% earlier, and we look at about 1.9% today. And what Mr. President talked about the global average and the warnings from the World Bank and the IMF and the OECD about a slowing down in the global economy. Andrew, what do you see here? Do you think our projections and these headline metrics has been outlined are really in order and in tune with the rest of the world?
I'm very concerned about the global economy. I mean, we're getting almost daily news of how rapidly it's decelerating in China. Yesterday, there was news out about German industrial production, which has shrunk for, I think, almost 2 years, every month for 2 years in a row. I think $57 oil benchmark may be optimistic. I think that the growth rate outside of Nigeria is going to be revised down. So I think we should be prepared for a world in which nothing outside of Nigeria or Africa is going to help the Nigerian or African economies. The only people that can help the Nigerian economy are Nigerians.
All right, very great panelists yesterday here on Budget 2020 presentations and economic signaling by Mr. President. Let's take a break. Now let's get other views into this very big story and, of course, the latest IMF report on Nigeria. Take a Break everyone with us about 2 minutes.